Greg had been homeless for 3 years, ever since he lost his job at the warehouse due to downsizing, and then his apartment due to debts. That day, he sat on the edge of the sidewalk, holding a cardboard cup with a few coins inside. People walked past him, some threw $1, some looked away, and most simply ignored him. Homelessness wasn't uncommon in Freeport, but lately, the tension in the city had been rising. The local elections were approaching, and one of the mayoral candidates, Elaine Carter, had made fighting the homeless crisis her campaign slogan. Her billboards with the phrase "Clean Streets, Strong City" hung on every corner, and her speeches at city meetings promised tough measures. Greg heard all of this on an old radio he found in a dumpster, and he knew that for people like him, this meant not help, but exile. That cool October morning, a man approached Greg, someone he immediately recognized. Tall, with a stern gaze and a posture that exuded confidence, Clint Eastwood looked as if he'd just stepped off the screen of one of his old westerns. He was over 90, but the years had only added sharpness to his face, not frailty. Clint stopped a few steps away from Greg, holding a paper cup of coffee from the local diner. He wasn't in Freeport by accident. His film crew was working a few miles away, at an abandoned farm, but that day he decided to walk around the city alone. "You look like you could use something warm," Clint said in his low, gravelly voice, extending the coffee. Greg looked up, surprised not only by the gesture but also by the person standing before him. He took the cup with trembling hands, feeling the warmth seep into his frozen fingers. "Thanks," he muttered, trying not to show his excitement. "Are you really Clint Eastwood, or have I lost my mind?" Clint smiled slightly, sitting down on the curb next to Greg. There was a leisurely pace to his movements, that of a man who knows the value of time. "That's me. Who are you?" "Greg." "Just Greg," the man replied, looking away. "Nothing special. Just another nobody the city threw to the side." Clint was silent for a few seconds, looking at the road where old pickups and sedans passed by, some with the Carter for Mayor bumper sticker. Then he took a wallet out of his pocket, pulled out several bills, and handed them to Greg. It was 10 $100 bills, $1,000. "This isn't charity," Clint said, noticing the frown on Greg's face. "It's a chance. What you do with it is up to you." Greg took the money, but his face darkened. He knew that $1,000 wouldn't bring back the life he had lost. But in Clint's voice, there was something, not pity, but a challenge, that made him think. "Why me?" Greg asked, clutching the bills in his hand. "Because you haven't given up," Clint replied, standing up. "I can see it in your eyes. Most people would have walked away long ago." He left, leaving Greg with the money and thoughts buzzing in his head like a swarm of bees. But the peace didn't last long. A few minutes later, a police car pulled up to Greg. An officer in his mid-40s, with a stern look on his face, got out. His badge read Officer Jenkins. "What do we have here?" Jenkins asked, noticing the bills in Greg's hands. "Where does a guy like you get that kind of money?" "They gave it to me," Greg replied, trying to stay calm. "They gave it to you?" Jenkins raised an eyebrow mockingly. "Get up. Hands behind your back." "I didn't steal anything." Greg's voice trembled with outrage. He stood up but didn't resist as the officer began searching him. "We don't joke around with theft," Jenkins said, taking the money from Greg's pocket. "You're coming with me to the station, we'll sort this out." Greg felt anger and helplessness tighten around his throat. He knew no one at the station would believe his story about Clint Eastwood. To them, he was just another homeless man, someone they could accuse of anything. But instead of shouting or arguing, he sighed and looked Jenkins straight in the eye. "You can take the money," he said quietly. "But you can't take the truth. The person who gave it to me knows what happened. And I'm not a thief." Jenkins rolled his eyes, but something in Greg's calmness made him stop. He had just shoved Greg into the car when the sound of footsteps came from around the corner. It was Clint, returning with a coffee for himself. Seeing the scene, he walked closer, his gaze turning as cold as steel. "What's going on here?" Clint asked, stopping a few steps from the officer. Jenkins turned around, and his self-assurance instantly vanished when he recognized the actor. "Mr. Eastwood? This is just a check. We got a call about suspicious behavior. Suspicious. Clint furrowed his brows. I gave this man $1,000 5 minutes ago. If that's a crime, arrest me. Jenkins turned red, clearly not ready for such a turn of events. He released Greg and handed him back the money, mumbling apologies. Sorry for the misunderstanding, sir, he said, quickly getting in the car and driving off. Greg stood there, still holding the bills, and Clint looked at him with a barely noticeable smile. You didn't shout. Didn't fight. Why? Clint asked. Because I'm tired of losing to anger, Greg replied. But I don't know what to do with this, he nodded at the money. You'll figure it out, Clint said, turning back to his coffee. Start small. They parted ways, but for Greg, this was only the beginning. In a city where homeless people were seen as a problem to be solved, he felt like he had been given a chance, not just because of the money, but because someone had seen him as a person. But new challenges awaited. Elaine Carter and her campaign were gaining momentum, and the police seemed unwilling to leave him alone. After meeting with Clint, Greg returned to his temporary shelter, an old tent hidden in the bushes near the railroad tracks on the outskirts of Freeport. The evening air was cold, and the wind howled between the bare trees, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant diesel smoke. Greg sat on a piece of cardboard, holding the bills Clint had given him. $1,000, not just money, but a question: what's next? He could rent a cheap room for a month, buy warm clothes, eat something hot at a diner. But something in Clint's words, start small, kept him restless. This wasn't just a gift, it was a challenge. The next morning, Greg decided to head into the city center. He folded the bills into an old metal cigarette box he carried with him and tucked it into his jacket pocket. Freeport was waking up slowly. The old brick facades of the shops in the center were plastered with Elaine Carter's campaign posters, and on the corner near the library, a diesel generator hummed, powering a street heater for her campaign volunteers. Greg noticed people casting sideways glances at him as he walked by. His shabby appearance, dirty boots, worn jacket, a few days' worth of stubble, made him a stranger in this new Freeport that Carter promised. He entered the small Café Joe's, a place he used to visit with colleagues from the warehouse when he still had a job. Inside, it smelled of freshly ground coffee and warm pastries, and behind the counter stood Judy, an elderly woman with kind eyes and gray hair tied up in a bun. She recognized Greg, even though she hadn't seen him in years. Greg Thompson? My God, I thought you'd left the city long ago, she said, wiping her hands on her apron. Didn't work out, Judy, he replied with a faint smile. Can I get a coffee? And maybe something to eat. Judy nodded, but her gaze lingered on him a bit longer than usual. Of course. But tell me, what happened to you? You looked better when you worked at the warehouse. Greg sighed, sitting at a small table by the window. Life. Judy. Got laid off, then debts, then. Well, you see. She brought him coffee and a plate of eggs with toast, placing it in front of him without a word. Greg took a 20 from the box and handed it to her. Wow, where did this come from? Judy asked, surprised as she took the money. A man gave it to me. Said it was a chance, Greg replied, biting into a piece of toast. The food was warm, simple, but for him, it was the first decent breakfast in months. Judy nodded, but her face grew serious. Be careful, Greg. Things are tense right now. Carter wants to get rid of people like you from the city. Yesterday, her people were handing out flyers about cleaning the streets. The police are already chasing homeless people out of the parks. Greg gripped his fork tighter but stayed silent. He knew Judy was right. Officer Jenkins was just the beginning. That same day, as Greg was heading back to his tent, he was stopped by a man in an expensive coat with a Carter campaign badge on the lapel. It was Ronald Baker, Elaine's right-hand man and a local businessman who owned several warehouses in the city. You're Thompson, right? Baker asked, stopping in front of Greg. His voice was sharp, and his eyes cold. Heard you caused a scene with the police yesterday. And some Hollywood old-timer spoke up for you. I didn't cause a scene, Greg replied calmly. I was given money. The police thought I stole it. Baker scoffed mockingly.
Money? A guy like you.
Listen, Thompson, we've got an election coming up, and we don't want people like you ruining the image.
Get out of Freeport before we make you.
Greg felt anger rise in his throat but remembered Clint's words, "You didn't shout.
You didn't fight." He took a deep breath and looked Baker in the eyes. I'm not a thief, and I'm not trash. I live here just like you.
If you don't like me being here, that's your problem, not mine.
Baker raised an eyebrow in surprise but quickly recovered. You'll regret this, he said, turning and walking away.
In the next few days, Greg felt he was being watched. Police cars slowly passed by his tent, and one night, someone threw a stone at his tarp, leaving a note, "Leave or you'll regret it."
But Greg wasn't planning to run.
The $1,000 in his box had become not just money, but a symbol that he wasn't giving up. Meanwhile, Clint Eastwood had returned to Freeport. His film crew had finished work on a farm, but he'd heard from locals about the situation in the city. One evening, he stopped by Joe's, where Judy told him about Greg and the pressure being put on him. "This guy's holding up, but I'm afraid they'll break him," Judy said, pouring Clint a cup of coffee.
Clint nodded, his face unreadable. He's tougher than he looks. But I want to see how far this goes.
The next day, Elaine Carter was holding a rally in the city center. Greg decided to go, not to protest, but to understand what he was up against. He stood behind the crowd, listening as Carter spoke about the new Freeport and order in the streets. Her words were sharp, and the crowd applauded. But when she finished, Greg stepped closer to the stage. The security tried to stop him, but he raised his hands, signaling that he wasn't looking for trouble. "Ms. Carter," he said loudly, and the crowd quieted.
"You say you want clean streets.
But what are you doing for the people who ended up on them not by choice?"
A silence fell.
Carter looked down at him condescendingly but replied, "We're offering solutions. Shelters, programs. But those who refuse help have no right to complain." "And what if your shelters are full, and your programs don't work?"
Greg asked calmly. "I've been on the housing list for 2 years. I was laid off from a job I loved.
What was I supposed to do?"
The crowd whispered.
Some turned away, others looked at Greg with curiosity. Carter opened her mouth to respond, but just then, Clint Eastwood stepped out from the crowd.
His presence made everyone fall silent.
"I gave this man $1,000, Clint said, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "Not because he asked, but because he deserves a chance. The question is, Ms. Carter, what is your city doing for people like him?" Carter went pale, and the crowd erupted in murmurs and shouts. Greg stood there, feeling his pulse thudding in his temples. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew this was just the beginning of a much bigger fight. And somewhere behind him, Baker was already whispering something to Jenkins, their gazes promising Greg more trouble ahead.
The rally for Elaine Carter ended in chaos.
After Clint Eastwood's words, the crowd split. Some clapped, others booed angrily, and local newspaper reporters rushed to get comments. Greg stood aside, feeling the cold wind pierce through his jacket, but for the first time in a long while, something like hope burned in his chest. Clint approached him and placed a hand on his shoulder.
"You did well," he said quietly. "But this isn't over yet."
Greg nodded, watching as Baker and Jenkins disappeared into the crowd.
He knew they wouldn't give up so easily.
The following days in Freeport grew heated, not just because of the unexpected autumn sun peeking through the clouds, but also due to the tension that gripped the town. Greg's words at the rally spread across local social media pages, and Clint's presence added weight to the story. Someone in the crowd had filmed a video, and within 2 days, it had garnered thousands of views. "Hollywood star versus Freeport mayor," the headlines read. But for Greg, it wasn't just noise, it was the moment his voice was finally heard.
Elaine Carter responded quickly.
The next day, she held a press conference outside City Hall. Behind her stood Jenkins and Baker, and in the background, the flags of Illinois fluttered. She spoke confidently, holding a folder of documents in her hands. "We respect every resident of Freeport, but there must be order," she said, looking into the cameras. "Mr. Thompson and his supporters want to dramatize the situation, but we are offering real solutions. New shelters, jobs, and safety for all." Greg watched the broadcast on an old TV at Joe's coffee shop. Judy stood beside him, arms crossed. "She's lying," Judy said quietly. "The shelters are overcrowded, and the jobs are just seasonal warehouse work for bakers' wages." "I know," Greg replied, finishing his coffee. "But I'm not going to shout about it. There's another way." That evening, Greg took his box of money and went to the local library, one of the few places where he wasn't kicked out. He asked the librarian, an elderly woman named Martha, to help him find information on grants for the homeless and support programs. Martha, who had known Greg since he was a regular customer with books on American history, was surprised but agreed. "Do you want to do something with this?" she asked, clicking her mouse on the computer. "Yes," Greg replied. "If I can't change everything, at least I'll start with myself. And maybe I'll help someone else." A few hours later, they found a small fund that provided microgrants for people in need. Greg filled out an application, a simple but heartfelt one. He told his story, about losing his job, struggling with the system, about the $1,000 from Clint, and how he wanted to use the money to open a small co-op for the homeless, a place where people could fix old furniture or sew clothes for a small fee. He put $500 of the money Clint gave him as an initial contribution. Meanwhile, the pressure on Greg increased. One night, 2 men in masks tore apart his tent and scattered his belongings. On the ground, they left a note, "Final warning." Greg gathered everything he could and moved his home closer to the town to an abandoned garage that Judy allowed him to use. But he didn't give up. Every day, he returned to the library, checking his mail and working on his plan. A week later, the response came. The fund approved his application and added another $2,000 to his contribution. Greg sat at the table in the library, holding the letter in his hands, and for the first time in years, he felt tears rolling down his cheeks. Martha placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did it, Greg," she said softly. But the real twist came just a few days before the election. Clint Eastwood returned to Freeport, not alone, but with several journalists from major outlets. He invited them to Joe's, where Greg had already gathered his first group of homeless people, 5 men and women who agreed to try working at his co-op. In the corner of the coffee shop, they were fixing old chairs, and on the table lay pieces of fabric for sewing warm hats. Clint sat at the table opposite Greg, while cameras hummed around them. "You used my money not just for yourself," Clint said, his voice low and firm. "You gave others a chance. I knew I wasn't wrong about you." Greg smiled, though his hands trembled. "I just wanted to show that we're not garbage. We're people." The journalists recorded every word. The next day, the article appeared on the front pages. Clint Eastwood and a homeless man from Freeport challenged the system. Greg's story went viral, and the pressure on Carter increased. Her approval ratings started to drop, and people in the town began talking about how maybe cleaning the streets wasn't about eviction but about support. On election day, Greg stood by the polling station, not to campaign, but to vote for the first time in years. He didn't know if Carter would win, but he felt that something important had already changed. The co-op had started to make its first money, a few locals had ordered repaired chairs, and Judy was selling their hats at the coffee shop. It was a small step, but for Greg, it was a whole world. Clint called him that evening. Greg sat in the garage, listening to the crackle of an old radio, when he heard the familiar raspy voice. "You didn't just survive, Greg. You showed them what strength is," Clint said. "I'm proud of you." "Thanks," Greg replied, his voice breaking. "But this isn't over, is it?" "No," Clint laughed. "This is just the beginning." When the radio announced that Carter had lost by a narrow margin, Greg stood up and went outside. The night was clear, stars shining over Freeport, and the smell of autumn leaves mixed with the warmth coming from the small heater in the garage. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, he felt that his life was in his hands. And somewhere deep inside, he knew, the small step he took was already changing the town, and perhaps, not just his own.